All right, I think we might get underway. Welcome everyone to tonight's event, a public debate called Brain Control, the Impact of Science and Technology on Our Mental Health, Law and Privacy. My name is Adrian Carter and I'm the Director of Neuroethics for the ARC Centre for Integrative Brain Function, who are one of the main organisers of tonight's event. And I'm also the Director of Community Engagement and Neuroethics for the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health. It's fantastic to see so many people here for this event in such a beautiful space, and we're very privileged to be one of the first to be in here to witness it. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the first and continuing custodians of the land on which we're gathered here this evening, the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people who may be here this evening. Brain Control is an initiative of the Centre for Excellence for Integrative Brain Function, the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health, and the Law, Health and Wellbeing Group at Monash University. As we'll see tonight, rapid advances in neuroscience and technology raise important ethical, social and legal issues that we as a society need to grapple with. And these organisations are committed to examining the impact of neuroscience on society. And now to tonight's topic. Over 85% of Australians have a smartphone or some form of digital device. Data collected from these devices are being used to predict individuals who may go on to develop mental illnesses or other kind of neurological disorders, such as dementia, Parkinson's disease and depression. And this is simply by analysing our interaction with our phones, so our keystrokes, our swipes, our location and GPS data, our speech patterns, as well as our posts on social media. There's an enormous amount of information, personal information, that can be gleaned from this data that I don't think we were all completely aware of and we're starting to come to terms with. For instance, these technologies may enable clinicians to provide targeted treatments in real time. So rather than waiting for an appointment in 6 months' time, you'll get an instant kind of intervention potentially. It may even be possible in the future to identify those who are about to attempt suicide and alert health services to intervene. These developments promise to revolutionise our ability to diagnose and treat disorders of the brain. However, the collection and sharing of such personal information raises deep ethical concerns around privacy and discrimination that the panel is going to discuss tonight. If you'd like to participate in the debate tonight through Twitter, please use the hashtag BrainControl, one word, and we'll pose some of your questions to the panel. It is my great pleasure to welcome the moderator for tonight's discussion, John Fain. Many of you will know John as the former host of Mornings on ABC Radio Melbourne. John is also an alumni of Monash, so we're particularly pleased to have him here tonight to moderate this interesting discussion. So please join me in welcoming John Fain.
Thank you, Adrian, and I'm one of those Monash graduates. I think they were pleased when they saw the back of me, actually, but there we go. Just before we get too far into it, though, these are wonderful gadgets, but if they ring at the wrong time, they really interrupt. And if you could just do the speakers the courtesy of checking that your phone is either on silent or maybe even off, which I know that's pretty radical, but it can happen. In fact, I'm told it's really good for them to be turned off from time to time, but there you go. And I'd like to share with Adrian my respect for the traditional owners of this land, but also add to it my impatience for a treaty or treaties so that we can at least start to, first of all, acknowledge the mistakes that we made in the past and start to repair the damage. Thank you. You may have noticed that this space that we're in is part of the refurbished library. Only yesterday, the glitterati of Melbourne were welcomed here by the Library Board and the Premier, and we are in this space on one very strict condition. We're not allowed to publish any photos of the public spaces because that is a planned release, and the library have a particular strategy in place, and we're not allowed to interrupt it. So people are taking photos, but you're not allowed to publish them on your social or anti-social or other media in any way until after the rest of the library's big unveil has taken back. So you can live tweet, you can text, but not images, and we want to respect that embargo. It's a condition of our being allowed to be here today. Now, there's a couple of hundred people here in this room, and while you've been quietly sipping away and munching on the goodies, I've been watching you. And from what we've monitored from your use of your phones, your Fitbits, your smart cards and other material, there's 32 of you at the risk of early dementia, 18 of you urgently need an MRI, 2 of you are going to need stents in the next 48 hours, and you'll need to go and see a neurosurgeon or maybe even something worse. And that's just from monitoring the gadgets that we know about. We don't know which of you have got gadgets that we're not monitoring for. But we're also wondering about the 8 people in the audience who have warrants out for their arrest for unpaid fines. And from the glasses that you've kindly handed back to the waiters, we'll collect your DNA and start a data bank in order to put it to some undoubtedly evil use, not very far in the future. So welcome to 2020, ladies and gentlemen. And it's not that far away. In fact, it's only weeks away, but it's very much where we're heading. How far away is it that your Fitbit becomes a remote control? How far away is it before the information that you've given away innocently is conglomerated and put together with information you didn't even know you'd handed over last time you gave blood or were at the hospital? And someone somewhere knows all sorts of things about you, some of which you may not even know yourself. And even though 2 million Australians opted out of the My Health record system, that means there's 25 million Australians who didn't. And how far in the future is it when those 2 million people who opted out turn up to hospital and the doctor or the nurse or triage say, "Oh, you're one of those. You're not in the system. You'll have to wait." And what does that mean? All of this is a leap into the unknown. Let me introduce our panellists, because we've assembled the great and the good here for you. And starting with Mark. Mark Andrzejewicz is Professor of Communications and Media Studies at Monash, and his expertise is in social and cultural implications of data mining and online monitoring. He writes about it, 60 academic articles, 3 monographs, articles, book chapters. He is it and a bit on this stuff. Digital media, surveillance, data mining in the digital era, social forms of sorting and automating technology, all of this is what he's here for. And undoubtedly we're going to pick his brains and see what data is stored in there tonight. Next to me, Verinda Edan is the Chief Operating Officer of the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. She has 20 years of experience working in this field. Starting out as a health professional, her work is shaped both by personal experience as well as her training and her professional leadership. Ministerial committees, research, being a consumer voice and a leader in a consumer voice means that she is able to provide us with that very special and rare experience of someone who has lived what they're talking about. It's not every day that we have that advantage with us today. Sven, next to me here, I've lost his biog, which is, here it is, it's on the back of the other page. Sven Blumenthal is the Victorian Information Commissioner, and he occupied that position in Western Australia before coming here to Victoria. He's survived a number of terse encounters with John Fane on ABC Radio Melbourne, and despite that, has been prepared to bless us with his expertise today. He's on an assortment of federal and state committees, has great responsibility for dealing with that most important pillar of democracy, freedom of information, and can provide us with his perspectives invaluably today. And finally, from Canada, Professor Judy Isles from Vancouver, and she is the world's expert in this field. She's a Professor of Neurology, she's the Canada Research Chair in Neuroethics at UBC in Vancouver, and I could read out the rest of her CV here and we'd have no time to hear her speak. It is overwhelming, and we're very lucky to have her here. She has connections right across North America on every major tertiary and ethical institution that you can imagine. She's also a member of the Order of Canada, elected to the Royal Society of Canada, And I won't be surprised if you end up being in Government House at some stage. Can we nominate you for that? Could you make our panel very welcome, please? Now, Verinda, can I start with you? It's hard enough being a consumer advocate in the world we're used to. What's it going to be? What are the implications of some of these emerging technologies from a consumer perspective first, before we hear from the experts?
Consumers have a number of concerns about some of these advancements, and you've actually touched on some of them already. But really quickly, the three things that come up mostly for consumers is about privacy and confidentiality, and we've seen some examples recently. As recently as today, there was an article about clinicians being able to override your health record restrictions. So when you've put a restriction on your health record that you don't want someone to see it, they're overriding it. So that's a real concern. I am one of the 2 million that opted out, very proudly. So that's a real concern for us about privacy and confidentiality. We're also really worried about the use of algorithms to detect when you're becoming suicidal or depressed, and how social media companies are saying that they're just going to report you directly to the local CAT team or police or whatever. That's an incredible invasion of privacy, but also really problematic because it fails to acknowledge that people have a whole range of emotions and often don't need that sort of intervention.
Don't you trust an algorithm? Look how well it's worked with... I mean, look at Robodebt, how fabulous it's been there.
Yes, well, that absolutely goes to the problems that we see with it. And the final one that is of real concern to consumers at the moment is the use of AI to replace therapists and the chatbots and those sorts of things, because we know from really robust evidence that actually what works for people in therapy is the relationship you develop with your therapist. And I'm not quite sure how good a relationship with your computer is going to actually help you.
But if there are aspects of that therapeutic relationship that can be taken away from the individual, not the entire relationship, but can I call it the maintenance side of a therapeutic relationship, not the intervention, not the emergency, wouldn't that be a good thing? Then the therapists can concentrate on the people who really need them rather than just regularly just checking in on people.
No, it is actually the relationship that you have with someone that works. It's not the therapy itself. Although guidance around therapies and how to interact with people are important, the evidence actually shows it is the personal relationship you have with someone that both improves your wellness but also maintains that wellness.
Judy, are we jumping at shadows here? Are we getting alarmed and getting caught up in really kind of exciting science fiction rather than reality?
Oh, I don't think we're talking about science fiction at all. And so if I were to take your question that you asked Vinda and address it, I'll address it adding a few more layers to the conversation. One is about informed choice. So in the theme of brain control, we've been talking about privacy and relationships. I think we're also seeing new technologies that are coming online, both that are non-invasive, like the kind of technologies you may be able to purchase in your big box stores that are called wearables. They kind of look like headsets, and they can stimulate your brain, and they can read signals, and where those signals go, some we know, some we don't know. There's a lot of also issues around invasive technologies that are coming online they're coming back online after many years of having gone dark to treat mental health disorders and addiction. There we're seeing some cautionary carryover from the past in terms of the fears about modulating the brain surgically, whether it's reversible or not. There remains a lot of stigma around that. And aside from informed choice, I want to put something on the table. I'm going to test it on this audience actually for the first time, and that is, it has to do with AI ethics and how we are relying on algorithms to tell us how we ought to behave and feel and how our therapists ought to interact with their patients. And we used to have in our world of medicine what we called paternalism, We held physicians in high regard. What they knew and what they told us was what we followed. We moved into a place of what I would call, and what many people would call, shared decision-making, where those relationships, where that conversation was really, had both sides. It was what the physicians suggested, what they informed us with, and then we made some decisions together. And I think now with AI ethics and algorithms, the term I want to put on the table is machinalism. So are we now going to be going down a path where our algorithms are actually dictating what we do? A move from paternalism, a move from shared decision-making into this weird space of computers and algorithms setting us down a path that I'm not really sure where we're going to end up.
Machinalism, Mark, what do you make of that? And we need the mics, because there's 4 of you, we need the mics right up to your mouth. Thank you.
Machinalism does, I think it's a nice term because it captures one of the tendencies in this algorithmic decision-making space, which is to imagine the possibility of escaping the horizon of humans participating in these processes. And more often than not, what's actually happening is the human participation is irreducible. So the biases that are in the data or that are in the algorithms get baked into the machines, but then we misrecognize them and we don't see them, and we think the machine might be making some, neutral decision. When there actually isn't. You can reduce bias, you can find ways to counter bias, but you can't eliminate it. There's no such thing as a kind of perfect bias-free machine, and we've seen many cases where systems that have meant to be convenient or to save on time and mental wear and tear end up reproducing forms of bias in ways that are invisible unless you go back and try to look at the bias in the outcomes or try to understand what's going on in the way the programming worked. I would add to machinalism another area that might be interesting to talk about, which is so-called, I've heard this term used, emergent medical data. And the idea there is that thanks to the interactive technologies that collect all kinds of information that you referenced at the very beginning of the presentation, it's possible to run correlations and do large-scale forms of data mining to find emergent correlations that might otherwise not be detectable. So I can give you an example. A small-scale study was run off of Facebook data, and they found that people who used heavily religious language, that served as a predictor for diabetes down the road. Now, that was a small-scale study. I don't know if that's a statistical artifact. This was in the US.
People who use religious language.
Strongly religious language, that became a predictor of diabetes down the road. And there's no particular explanation. You might come up in your mind with some explanations for that. But it doesn't.
The Lord works in mysterious ways.
But it doesn't really matter from the point of view of the healthcare provider, the insurance provider, who might be interested in using that information to screen patients. And you can imagine other forms of conditions. Again, I'm not saying this is true, I'm just saying the study found this. I'm noting it's a small-scale study, but what I want to point to is the idea that when you have large amounts of data, you can look for surprising, unanticipated consequences that make data that we don't think of as medical data turn into medical data, and then not be subject to the kinds of controls that we would want medical data to have.
Sven, people have concerns. We're hearing a few of them already. We've only been talking for 10 minutes. Surely, though, the benefits of this technology are worth pursuing, if only we can come up with the right regulatory environment to make it safe.
Well, overall, I'd certainly suggest that there are potential benefits, and we shouldn't close our minds to that. But it's a complex issue to even discuss what the benefits are. I mean, benefits to whom? If you have an ethical framework that suggests, well, we should use these technologies if there is a net benefit, what do we mean by that? Net benefit to whom? What if some proportion, a minority of us suffer, but the rest of us get ahead from it. Well, that's probably not something in a modern society we'd be prepared to accept. And on all of these issues, we've actually my office has just released a free ebook on artificial intelligence, the ethics, the technology of it, called
Available for free download if you provide a lot of data before. Fill in a 4-page form and give away your bank account details too.
That would indeed be a terrible look for a privacy regulator. I agree with that. But the first part, free download, is there. It's called Closer to the Machine, a very deliberately ominous title. But we certainly shouldn't close our minds to that. And certainly as a regulator, I'm not suggesting, look, all use of artificial intelligence should be stopped or anything like that, because there are some potentially very, very useful insights. But as you say, we need to have a regulatory framework that allows us to do that in a manner that we as a modern participative society consider is worthwhile and is appropriately regulated. And I don't think we're there at the moment.
Are you confident, given where we've gone with regulation in the last decade, that the next decade will satisfy what you regard as the minimum requirements?
Well, certainly I hope so. And maybe I'm just an optimist, but I think we have to get there. Are we there at the moment? Frankly, nowhere close. And I've recently sort of developed with my staff a couple of sort of major critiques of how our privacy laws are probably conceptually being strained and are not able to cope. And one of those really is this issue of consent. A lot of what we talk about is in privacy law is based on consent. It's transactional. As long as you consent, we're all free individuals. We can make that choice. We should be free to do that. But we don't do that with other things. We don't say, well, you should be able to consent to taking a drug that is known to be unsafe, or well, a pharmaceutical drug, a prescription drug, let me put it that way. We're not saying that. We're not saying that you should be able to go into a public building that is a known fire hazard on the basis that you're consenting to that. When we all came in here tonight, we could all take for granted that in 21st century modern Australia, this building is safe to a level that we accept. We're not provided when we walk in here with 50 pages of terms and conditions saying, you decide whether it's safe. So I think that's one way in which privacy law is straining. And the other way I think we've already touched on is just the sheer scale and development of how information is used for one, or is collected for one purpose and ultimately used for a different one. How can you consent to that when even the companies that are collecting it right now don't yet know to what use it may one day be put?
All right, I want to get to Verinder on this, but just before we do, help us understand globally, Judy, where's the best regulatory framework that we might want to look to for inspiration or modelling?
I don't know the answer to that question. What jumps to mind right away is the OECD and some of the work that the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development has been working on in the area of brain in particular, and also privacy and data sharing. They've done an excellent job in bringing companies together, particularly in the neurotechnology space, so in the space of the development around brain technologies, into a common area to speak about what are some of the challenges and hopes and goals and cautions that we need to put in place as we think about responsible innovation. So OECD jumps to mind, I think, first, especially in its ability to bring industry from all over the world, like China and South Korea and the Americans, and they don't always get together in the room all so willingly when it comes to research, in Canada and others. So I would turn to them. And when we're allowed to ask questions, I have one for Sven.
Ooh, that's ambitious. We will get there, and there will be a chance for questions from the floor a little later on too, and I'll give you the rules and regulations and all the privacy settings for that when we get there too. Do you trust people who tell you you should trust them?
No.
So
I can speak more.
How do you decide whether to trust someone when they say, trust me, we'll look after you, we'll protect you, we'll keep your data safe, we'll keep your medical records safe, we won't misuse the information that you confide us with?
I can't through experience. So I can't trust that through my own experiences and through the experiences that get shared with us at VMIAC, that these breaches occur on a daily basis around our information. And so it was interesting, and I did sort of react to Sven saying you can't consent to medication that can damage you, actually, no, we can't consent because the psychiatrist gives it to us against our will. So when you've got systems where we've got a mental health law that removes my rights around things like medication and who gets my information, then I can't trust anything that you put in place, any regulation, because if I become a compulsory patient under the Mental Health Act, those rights fly out the window and a psychiatrist gets to make that decision.
Okay. And there are indeed psychiatrists who make those decisions in this city, and we are minutes walk away from the site where terrible things have happened, which could have been prevented. So, Judy, if the medical information available in a forensic, in a criminal law setting, indicates that someone has a predisposition and even a likelihood of committing a terrible massacre or an event that's going to cost lives, aren't we as a society obligated? Isn't there a heavy duty on us to make use of that medical technology to prevent some form of evil from taking place? How can we not take advantage of that technology?
So that's an entirely heavy question.
That's why we're here. That's why you're paid the big bucks.
So how to unpack a question like that in some short phrases? So the first thing that comes to my mind is you'll all remember the movie, I hope, Minority Report, where the movie was about incarcerating people who had thoughts that predisposed their violent actions. And of course, it raised a host of questions about the ethics of incarcerating people who had not actually acted upon their intention, but who just had an intention or an intention for an intention. And what does that have to do with our free will, our ability to act freely in a society? We would have to be very cautious and have some very advanced technologies, whether they were Fitbits, measuring our body physiology, or our brain sensors measuring our brain waves, that would have an incredibly high degree of accuracy to be able to act on a signal that suggested a violent act was forthcoming. Mm-hmm. And so the risk of false positive would almost have to be negligent, and that's almost impossible in medicine. And so we really have to carefully weigh the risks to society in a very utilitarian sort of way against the protections of society should a heinous condition present itself in the way that you ask it, John.
But Mark, we're doing that now. We have aircraft hangars full of people in this country and in all around the world who are spying on our communications, looking for keywords in social media posts, text messages, eavesdropping on phone calls, mass surveillance to detect terrorism and other threats to our security. What's the difference taking it to the next level?
Well, you know, when it comes to this type of probabilistic data prediction, one of the things they've found is that these systems work quite well for quite common events. Where they tend to break down is exceptional events. And the ones that we're talking about when we talk about the types of violent acts, outbreaks that you've mentioned are, fortunately, for the moment, exceptional events. And that means that trying to do these routine forms of data prediction doesn't give you a high degree of reliability. Now, at the same time, to get to Sven's point, I don't want to downplay the possible benefits of doing protective and preventative work. The question is, what level of intervention or response is appropriate, especially when you know that the predictability of unpredictable events is quite low. And so that means you might use the system, but act with caution, and you probably don't want to use it to replace other forms of addressing the social issues that you're trying to engage with. So, for example, in the US, where unfortunately events like school shootings have become much more common than they once were, one of the responses has not been what you might think of as a common sense policy response, which is to engage in the forms of gun control that might address this issue, but instead to look at forms of surveillance and sentiment mining and sentiment analysis associated with social media. That's trying to solve a problem that could be addressed in other ways socially with data. Okay. And I think we have to guard against trying to solve everything with data.
Sven, does a recidivist arsonist have a right to privacy?
Certainly under the law they do, but
should they though? We're approaching a terrible bushfire season. We already know there have been multiple fires, some that have cost lives, that have been deliberately lit, and we know that arsonists are recidivists.
Well, in that case, even at the moment, even though they have a right to privacy, that right is not absolute, in the same way that none of us have an absolute right to privacy. We have hopefully strong rights to privacy, and I think they should be stronger. But when it comes to the recidivist arsonist, all Australian privacy laws allow the use of personal information in a law enforcement context where it is necessary to prevent harm to life. Now, you have to be very careful, of course, in how that's interpreted. And even in the earlier question of, even if we had the data that says, look, there's a really high likelihood here, collecting and using that data is one thing. And as I said, most Australian privacy laws would allow that subject to a certain threshold. It's another thing to then say, and therefore we, the state, have the right to lock them up before they actually commit an offence. Mm-hmm. And I think with that latter point, we have to ask ourselves, how dearly do we as a society hold that as a principle, as a fundamental principle, to say that until you've actually done something wrong, or there is a certain threshold reached that indicates that you have taken action towards that negative goal, you are not guilty in a way that you can be locked up without a trial, for example.
Except if you have a mental illness.
Well, that's a fair point, yeah.
Or you fall within the remit of a top secret squad in the Victoria Police, which won't be top secret anymore. There is in Victoria Police, you may have even signed off on this, a fixated persons squad. And that has developed because of a realisation that there are a certain group of repeat offenders in the community who signal their intentions through their own actions. Indeed, they almost call for intervention. They write letters. The letters are constant. They write around the margin of the letters. They use different coloured pens. They write on the envelopes. They go on hunger strikes. They write to politicians. They ring up radio stations. They behave in a very predictable fashion in an escalating level of distress, if you want to take that approach to it. And it ends with a Lindt Cafe siege, which was the classic example of a fixated person, Man Monis. He would stand on the steps of the court holding a sign. He would write to politicians. He would intervene in all sorts of different ways. And then eventually a whole bunch of people died because of his actions. And now New South Wales and Victoria Police have both got a fixated persons squad where they predict the escalation of dangerousness in exactly that way, not just using social and other media, but even what's called legacy media, you know, old-fashioned stuff too. So if we can do that, what's the difference in taking that next step and saying, well, we can keep the community safe, and really privacy is so 20th century anyway, if it keeps the public safe.
And that argument that privacy is dead, or we need to get over privacy, or privacy is an impediment, is something that 5-10 years ago I think was a very widely supported view. I think it's becoming a less supported view because we now realise how data itself can become weaponized. In the example you gave with fixated persons, 2 points I'd like to make about that. One is that even those units, certainly in Victoria, are not exempt from privacy laws. They still have to meet certain thresholds to be able to use information and for certain limited purposes. But beyond that, a broader point I'd like to make about that is that one of the real dangers I see with the way data is being collected and used, more so by the private sector, is that it's not just about knowing who you are and predicting what you might do as, say, a consumer. It's also about trying to control you into changing your behavior. And what I mean by that is those algorithms in YouTube and in chat rooms on Facebook that are designed to keep you on there, they reward content that leads to that sort of behavior. In fact, one of the arguments from Cambridge Analytica in trying to sell its software to political campaigns was to say, not only can we find the people that might support you because they're angry and disenfranchised, we can make them angrier for you, and they'll be more receptive to your message, which goes from being able to sell you something to being able to manipulate you to behave differently to how you otherwise would. And I think that issue of the sort of fixated person, I think, is really crucial in that regard.
Verinda, this can be comforting as well as threatening. If you can use this technology to save people from self-harm, isn't that consumer friendly?
No, I don't think it is. I think that there's a lot of emotion attached around self-harm and suicide. They're the two things that come up most around this. I personally don't. I believe that that the focus on zero suicide is unreal. Like it's just completely crazy. It's so mad. I don't quite know why other people are saying it. So I don't. My concern about this is that we have over the past 20 years, or 30 since I trained as a nurse originally, our scope of what is emotional distress being diagnosed as mental illness has reduced. Mm-hmm. So 30 years ago when I trained as a nurse, you had to have 8 of 12 symptoms of depression every day, all day, for more than 6 weeks to get a diagnosis of depression. And now it's something like 4 of 12 symptoms for 2 weeks. The other thing they've done in the latest DSM-5 Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the Bible so-called, is that they've also withdrawn the requirement that it be in the absence of grief. So 2 weeks after you've lost your partner of 50 years, you could be diagnosed and prescribed antidepressants. And that is appalling. And I think that these algorithms don't take into account the normal level of distress, which is actually what we need. You know, you've got to know what it's like to be bad in order to be happy. You've got to know a variety of emotions in your life. And I'm really concerned, and a lot of consumers are really concerned, that these very narrow ideas that we're promulgating in society by, Beyond Blue and other organisations like that you have this narrow of what's normal. And so these algorithms are focused on that narrow what's normal and not actually allowing people the breadth of human emotion.
Judy, let's go to your workplace. The university's just decided they're going to provide a gym for all the staff at the university. Thousands of people will be able to access it, and you've got a swipe card which gets you in and turns on all the machines as you go. It's recording how you're going and whether you're making progress. You can chart, you can track, you can check on your laptop or on your smartphone. Fabulous. University's full of healthy, fit, trim, wonderful staff. Who owns the data?
So the ownership of the data depends on what the conditions of opting in are to belong to that fancy gym that you just described. And those conditions ought to exist if they don't. And there ought to be a tremendous amount of openness and transparency about what the data are being collected, whether it's the movement of in and out of the facility, which reflects a certain privacy condition, as well as some of the physiologic data that might be collected, whether you're on a treadmill or a spin bike or a one of these Bowfix machines, whatever they're called, the multi things. I think it goes a little bit to Sven and his job, which is, what is privacy today? I'm slipping in the question that I've been dying to ask. What constitutes privacy, and what are our rights as individuals to opt in and opt out of our data? It certainly should not be sold unknown to us. That is truly a violation.
Everyone wants to jump in, but I just want to follow up. You put in an application for sick leave because you're just unable to cope. And the university's response is, well, you haven't been going to the gym, you haven't been getting fit, and we're going to refuse your application for sick leave because you haven't been helping yourself, you haven't been minimising your own ill health, you haven't been offsetting. And by the way, we've also reported your failure to the superannuation and life insurance people.
Okay, so that goes back to what are the conditions of my employment. If the conditions of my employment is that I must go to this gym, and in this gym, my coming and going and all my physiologic data, including my brain data, are going to be monitored, and I accept the conditions of that. I've accepted those conditions. But that's an opt-in. And if we opt out, or if I choose not to take that position, or if those conditions arrive suddenly in my workplace as a change to the conditions of my job, I have to have the right to decline and move on.
And in Sweden, there's a company now where people have a little grain, a little chip inserted in their hand in place of a swipe card to get in and out of the building, to turn on the photocopier, to log into their computers. And it's wonderful. It means you can't lose your card, you don't lose your pass, but it's also there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mark, how common do you think this will become, and what pitfalls do you see as part of it?
You know, I suspect, I'm not the best predictor, that the chip scenario is probably not the way we're headed. Although I did interview somebody once at the Nielsen media ratings company who wanted everybody chipped so they could figure out what they were watching. But I suspect what's going to happen is we're going to head in a more biometric direction. So rather than the chip being used to identify you, your face might be used to identify you, or your gait, or your pupil. And that way you carry with you, your identifying information in ways that are non-invasive, but that do generate all kinds of information about you, some of which goes far beyond identification.
Well, the wearable phone, as opposed to one I can put down, but one that's strapped to my wrist, is transmitting my whereabouts, my comings, my goings, all the time.
It's also on your skin, so it can collect biometric information about you, skin temperature, pulse rate. Once you move these devices onto your body, they generate new forms of data.
Google Glasses, likewise.
And can I chime in on the when it comes to who owns your data? Because when we talk about all of these devices that collect all of these data, what we have is also the question not just of who owns the data, but who's able to generate insights based on it, even if they don't own it. So take the gym scenario. Let's say your uni decides, well, we can't store all this data ourselves, it's a lot. We'll hire Amazon Web Services or Google. Amazon Web Services can now generate insights on that data even though they don't own it. And those insights may become very valuable to them. So they can see this person who does this frequency of exercise is more likely to have this medical or mental condition. And they don't need to own the data to find that out. But once they generate that information, that becomes information that's proprietary to them that then they're able to use in other commercial contexts. You want to screen employees that you're going to hire? I can tell you some insights about them that we garnered from having access to this data that we don't own. So there's that additional question, just who has access to it.
Would you like to have that level of insight into what your students are doing?
I'd like to be able to tell them that I do.
And if it told you who was cheating and paying someone else to write their essays for them?
This gets to this larger question, I think, of what it means to offload social relations onto data-driven systems. And I'm sensitive to what Verinda said earlier about the importance of the social relation. if I'm working with my students, I know what's going on. I mean, not all the time, but I don't necessarily need these data augmented systems, and I have a little bit of a worry as if I start to rely on them to displace the human social relationship that I have with them, and to be able to say, you know what, I don't need to talk to them. I can go and scan their data and see what's going on. That aspect worries me, of offloading the social onto the automated system. I think that's a tendency I'd like to avoid.
Okay, we're getting towards question time, and there's really only very simple rules and regulations around asking questions. First of all, we have 2 roving mics at the back and the side of the room. If you can signal, and we'll try and get a mic to you, and if you can wait till there's a mic so everyone can hear. If you could introduce yourself, you don't have to say everything about yourself, but just a name is nice so we know who you are. And if you could ask a question rather than make a speech, recite a poem, sing a song, just a question. And last request, could you ask your question of one member of the panel? Otherwise, you're asking 4 questions if you ask all of the panel, and that means fewer people get to ask a question. So if you want to give me a wave, I've got one last round with the panel, and give me a wave, and I'll, like the auctioneer on Saturday afternoon down the street from you, I'll take your bids in the order that I see them. So let's go back to where we started, who we can trust and what does the future look like. So take us 5 and 10 years down the track, Judy. What do you think? Where do we end up, do you think? What are you expecting?
What am I expecting in terms of data privacy? I am expecting greater reliance on technology. And I think if we do our job well, I'm expecting the industry, so innovators, discoverers, to exercise more humility and better judgment over their endeavors than we're seeing now. And Professor Carter and Walwish held a wonderful neuroscience and society conference over the past 2 days in which we were talking about governance. And I think we have to be exercising excellent reflection and articulating our aims and being transparent about our innovation and working carefully with regulators such as Sven and others to really innovate in a way that will most benefit people and society, those who are healthy and those who are vulnerable from neurologic and psychiatric conditions.
Do you think we'll lose control of our brains?
No.
Although there are people, and dare I say it, in countries not as free, as democratic and as liberal as ours, there are people already experimenting with implanted chips. This has happened in China. Implanted chips that can be externally not just monitored, but used to control, to influence the way people behave. Now, that to me is Orwellian. Other people see it as progress.
So I appreciate and I respect that question. I think we want to be very cautious to not hype up what might be. I just don't see that in our daily societies. It is, we as humans have curiosity at the core of what makes us human. We've been doing it since the ancients. We're putting holes into people's brains to release evil spirits at the time. And then 100 years later, going after stones of madness in people's brains. So we will continue to innovate on the brain. But I'm going to remain optimistic and not Orwellian and continue to do the kind of work that neuroethics is giving us that will prevent that sort of malevolent applications of the kind of progress that I believe we're seeing by and large in our laboratories and our commercial sector.
Mark, agree, disagree?
I tend to be more dystopian in disposition, I'm afraid. But you don't have to look to China. Look at Elon Musk. Look at Mark Zuckerberg. They have fantasies about direct brain interfaces. And those fantasies are very interesting. They're ideas that are going to enhance our communicative abilities, speed them up. Elon Musk is worried about, robots or machines surpassing us. And his idea is, we'll just meld with them. But the way we'll do it is I've got a machine, if you guys have probably seen this, called Neuralink, that's going to implant, thousands of tiny wires into your brain that will allow you to interface directly with your machines, because your physical interface is too slow. Your hands slow you down when you type. What if you could just think your article or think your paper? This is the Elon Musk fantasy. I don't know whether that's going to come true, but imagine the data collection possibilities. Right?
Don't tell Peter Dutton.
They're working towards it. It looks quite fantastical to me, but things that looked fantastical to me 10 years ago have come to pass. So I worry about my ability to decide what's fantastical and not.
Sven?
I predict with hope that the privacy discussion will become one about what it means to be human. And in Victoria, we have privacy as a human right. That's enshrined in our Human Rights Charter. And what I mean by that, I'd like to illustrate by way of a very quick example, which is that last year there were some issues about some schools in Victoria potentially having facial recognition cameras installed. And I was asked for my opinion about that. My opinion was it's appalling. And it's appalling notwithstanding all the safeguards. The safeguards are, oh look, the cameras won't be on all the time and there'll be all these restrictions on who can actually view the footage and it'll be tightly controlled. Don't worry, it's all very, very safe. Completely missing my point. My point was, I'm worried because what will that do to the next generation growing up if they think that surveillance by machines and authority is normal? What will that do to our public discourse? What will that do to the ability of the next generation and the one after that and so on to become critical thinkers, to not be coerced into all becoming compliant and all the same? Because if that happens, we're all doomed. Because every great advance in humanity was originally highly controversial and unorthodox. And if we bring up generations of kids that, because of surveillance being pervasive, stop challenging orthodoxy, then I think we're in trouble. And I'm hoping, therefore, and I'm doing everything I can, and I know many of my fellow regulators around the world are as well, to change the discussion in that direction.
Everyone will end up being Collingwood supporters if we go down that path. Brenda?
I'm going to take a quote out of one of my favourite TV characters, a little bit out of context. But Jean-Luc Picard once said, "Everything's impossible until it's not."
Yeah.
I think that if we had a society as utopian as Star Trek, then sure, go ahead, do what you want. I want that transporter. I want all of that. But while we're in the society that we're in, with the very messed up regulation, politicians controlling all of this, then I'm really, really concerned. And I think that we have to, the brain chip, but my understanding is in China, the facial recognition and the social rating, and you go to the right place, your rating goes up, and you go to the wrong place and your rating goes down. That sort of technology is here with us now, yes. and it is being used, and that's really concerning to us.
Couldn't agree more. Alrighty, I've got one question. Put your hand up just at the back there so that we can see. Oh, they're popping up all over the place. We'll start with the gentleman in the middle at the back there who was first. If one of the right there, wave your hand, wave it high. Gentleman there, get the microphone. Off we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. Phil is my name, and this question is for Sven with a little bit of Verinda in there, if I may. Just about a lot of the privacy questions today have come down to opt-in or opt-out, and I'd just like to highlight a bit of discrimination in that space, and that is that if you don't opt in, if you don't press yes on that end user agreement, you can be denied service. And particularly in services related to mental health, This can mean anxiety about ticking yes or anxiety about not getting the service. I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to that and how we can resolve this, because that's a human right, and enforcing it you're discriminated against.
Which is also a question about the digital divide, which is increasingly a part of life. Yeah.
Look, I think it's a really, really valid point. And I think what that does to me is it highlights the limitations of the consent model. Privacy laws just about all over the world are currently predicated on consent. You can opt in or you can opt out. You can make a free choice. I think that model is no longer fit for purpose, in part for the reasons you've suggested there. And I think I haven't got my model perfect answer for this, but I think the way we need to start heading is to say there are just certain things that we as a society have decided are not appropriate uses of our personal information, whether you consent or not, in the same way that we do with most pharmaceuticals, with building safety, as I mentioned earlier. So totally agree, and I think it shows the current limitations. Let's really look at a potentially very different model, which actually says there are some things you as an organisation or a government just should not be allowed to do.
Did you want to take up the invitation, Brenda?
I just reckon everybody should opt out of everything, and then we...
Hi, my name's Liz. I'm a neuroscientist researcher from the Uni of Melbourne. My question is for Vrinda. I really appreciate that the people who you represent have many reasons to be careful about whom they trust. So my question is, who do you trust more and why do you trust them?
Well, that's a personal question. Trust, you can't... So there's this really unreasonable expectation that you should trust people because of some artificially imposed authority. So if you want my trust, you have to earn it. So develop the relationship with me, work with me, but that's me, and it might be different for John. He might have a different approach to how he learns to trust someone.
I don't trust anyone.
So to me, it comes back to the personal relationship, which is why some of these things really are really concerning. Trust has to be earned. It cannot be, you cannot expect to have it just because you're a doctor or you're a privacy commissioner or whatever.
But we talk about the sense of entitlement in the community at the moment. We've got a trust of entitlement. We've got the banks have destroyed trust in the banks. The clergy have destroyed trust in the clergy. The lawyers, thank you Nicola Gobbo, have destroyed trust in lawyers, and so on. We can go through all the different institutions, the pillars of trust in our democracy, which is why it's wobbling.
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean we've got to recalibrate? Because you can't not, I mean, I'm joking, you can't not trust anybody.
No, I agree with you, but that's sort of a global thing. So I globally don't trust psychiatrists, but there's 2 or 3 that I do.
Yep.
that have earned my trust.
Yep.
So this is about, again, I go back to it's about individual relationships.
Okay.
Just accepting trust because you are a figure of authority is wrong.
All right, thank you. Now, woman here and then the woman there with her hand. Yeah, sorry, the one behind you actually has had her hand up before. So if you could start and then we'll get a microphone to you too, madam. Go ahead.
Was I a woman number 1?
Yes, you're next.
Yeah.
You have the floor.
Hello, my name's Sarah. Thank you for an excellent discussion. My question's for Judy. I'm just sort of playing the devil's advocate here a little bit, but...
Stand up, Sarah.
Sorry. Yeah. So my question's for you, Judy. And I'm just sort of playing the devil's advocate here a little bit. I understand some of these concerns are very real and very worrying, but they can be potentially perceived as somewhat paranoid as well, before we've actually got all the... these are future kind of worries that maybe haven't come about yet. So my question is, how do we strike a balance in between proceeding with caution and being rightfully concerned about certain things like privacy and brain control, but also not impeding innovation and moving forward?
No, it's a really important question, and it's a very delicate paradox. Judy.
It's a great question, thank you. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind, because there's a long list of answers I could give you, is that we have to be attentive to hype. And we have to map hype along a timeline. So I think we've all recognized tonight that society and innovation and privacy and artificial intelligence and everything, surveillance, is moving at a rapid rate. We're at a place today where we certainly were never at 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But there is a pace of innovation that we have to be respectful of. And while there are people like Elon Musk and Neuralink and others that we've worked with who have some fantasies about running chips into people's brains and the data that they'll generate. Are we really going to see that on a wide-scale societal level in my lifetime or yours? I don't think so. And so I think the caution comes with pacing our anxiety, paying attention to what is real today, what is realistic for tomorrow, and working with people like John and others and people in the mental health arena and neuroscientists to really be realistic about what we ought to attend to today and responsive and sort of interested in what the future might bring, but it'll be a little bit compartmentalized about what we really ought to be devoting our resources, both financial and attentive, to at the present.
Thank you. Now we have two adjoining questions, but the blonde woman first, and I'll come to you next.
My question is for Sven. I'd like to ask how we protect vulnerable members of society, particularly children and teens, who often by the time they turn 18 have huge data footprints that they didn't necessarily consent to being shared.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really important issue, and the example earlier about the surveillance in schools, I think, touches on that as well. How do we do it? Well, currently it's really difficult, and it again highlights the limitations of consent. Can a 4-year-old consent? I think we'd all say no. Can an 18-year-old consent? Almost certainly. What about a 12-year-old? What about a 14-year-old? All of those sorts of things. So I think, to leave it all to this magical consent, that as long as you draft the right terms and conditions that are 50 pages that no one ever reads before you click accept, you're fine as a company. I think that's got to stop, because it's letting people off the hook. It's letting companies off the hook. What can we do individually? Well, I think individually, as parents, as other people and so on, I think we just need to be aware of all of that. Be aware of the data footprint you're creating of your child or a child in your care, or the other children attending your child's birthday party. Don't post everything on Facebook. Just don't create this data pollution in the first place. Now, it's impossible to do that completely, I agree with that. But just think about that. Before you hit share next time, think about that. Is there a person in this photo that I have no right to post about? And there may well be, if it's a child especially.
Will there be any legal recourse for an 18-year-old if someone else, say a well-meaning parent, has shared information about them that later on, when they reach adulthood, they decide they don't want shared? And
this is called the right to forget, which is being introduced in some jurisdictions, where you can scrub a history.
Look, in short, in Australia, the very simplistic answer to that question is no, or not really. The right to be forgotten, I won't get into it, but it's not as broad as is thought. You can't just say, I don't like what's up there, I have a right to have it taken down. It is, even in Europe, the right is not that broad. That's an important point to bear in mind. But yeah, that's, how would you feel? This thing about, showing some infant or toddler in an embarrassing pose and posting that video up. How would you feel if your parents did that when you were that young? They didn't have the means, thankfully, but now they do. And I think we all just have to take a little bit more responsibility. I think ultimately, though, there should be much better regulation, and companies should not be able to get away with that. But also, every one of you, please bear that in mind, how much digital pollution you're putting out.
And last question it'll have to be, because we're virtually out of time. Go ahead.
So my name's Serena. Thank you for the talk. In terms of impact on mental health, we hear a lot of research about young people who spend hours on social media, how it can lead to greater anxiety and lower self-esteem. To Verinda and Professor Mark Andreevich, can you please comment on that?
Verinda.
As a parent, I have to say it really worries me. I mean, my kids are adults now and I don't have any say over what they do. But it does really concern me, the focus of particularly social media, Facebook, around things like body image and connections and peers and things like that. So that absolutely really concerns me. But I think that that's a broader thing. It's not the social media, it's about what we do with it and what we do as a society and how we respond to those issues in society. And I think that that's the bigger question, and it's a much harder question to answer.
Briefly, Mark.
I'm all in favour of responsible parenting and responsible behaviour on the part of children. I think we also need to take a look at the incentives that we have built into these systems. So some of the best minds of probably not my generation, but younger generations are devoted to trying to figure out how to get your kids to spend more time on social media. And they've got extensive research, they're developing sophisticated technology. So we're not just up against our own proclivities, we're up against a set of economic incentives that structure how these technologies are developed. And we might want to, as a society, revisit those incentives in order to move beyond just saying we need to be responsible, but to think about what it means to take responsibility for that as a society.
And exactly the same software that's used to make people addicted to poker machines is the same software and technology being used to make you addicted to your smartphone. And there is, I'm guaranteeing it, there is not a person in this room, there's not one of you that hasn't at some stage experienced anxiety about checking your phone. And this is an epidemic that's completely unremarked upon. My final remarks, it's a brave person who stands between a crowd and a drink, and I don't intend to be that brave, but we are living in an era of creeping authoritarianism. It's not driven by machine guns, it's being driven by algorithms and by software engineers. These are weapons just as effective as rockets or tanks or guns. But they're much more insidious because you don't even realise they've become weaponised. Progress is not inevitable and it's not linear. It doesn't go according to a line. It darts around the place. It goes backwards and forwards. Sometimes we slip. But if we're to get control of this delicate machine of democracy, we're going to have to lift the level of maintenance. We've been neglecting it. In 1895, because I'm a petrol head, I know these things, in 1895, Herr Benz and Herr Daimler collaborated to apply the internal combustion engine to the horseless carriage and came up with the motor vehicle. And that was civilization-changing technology. The world was never the same again. But it took until 1905 for rules about registration, licensing, insurance, and who gave way when two horseless carriages were heading towards each other. It took 10 years for those rules to develop. When Mark Zuckerberg came up with a way of ranking girls for their hotness at Harvard University, not that long ago, and turned it into Facebook, it's taking us until now to recognise the need to regulate in exactly the same way. The technology is society changing, but it's gone absolutely rampant without anyone doing anything about saying, hang on, we need some rules about this shit because otherwise it's going to control us. And the pirates who have got their hands on it are just as self-interested as Henry Ford and others were 110 years ago when they said, don't regulate the motor vehicle. It'll make it more expensive for people to buy it. It's the same nonsense now. And we're just waking up to it, hopefully in time. Final remarks from Adrian after what's been a really interesting hour, and he'll ask you to thank the panel, so hold your applause. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks so much, John. I think you'd agree that is a very rich and challenging discussion that we've been taken through this evening. I'm glad that we've been led on this beginning of this journey by such a fantastic panel of experts. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our panellists, Verinda, Sven, Judy and Mark. And of course to John Fain for leading us through the brave new world of brains and digital mental health in such an interesting and informative way. So thank you so much, John. As I said, I think we're just starting to begin this conversation. If you want to continue the conversation, get onto Twitter, use the hashtag BrainControl, and continue the discussion, and as we all kind of think and work our way through these ideas. I'd like to make a few little thank yous. First of all, I'd like to thank the team at the Centre for Integrative Brain Function, the director, Gary Egan, who couldn't be here this evening, Merrin Morrison and Glenn Papworth for their fantastic work in bringing this all together and getting us into such a unique space. I'd like to thank my employer, the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health, and as well the Faculty for Law, Health and Wellbeing Group, and in particular Jamie Walfish. So please give them all a round of applause. And thank you all for coming along and sharing your curious minds. This discussion doesn't happen without all your kind of ideas and thoughts, so please keep it coming. So thank you. If you missed some part of tonight's conversation or want to listen back, a video recording will be posted online on the Centre for Integrative Brain Function website. To join our mailing list, to keep up to date with latest developments in neuroscience, ethics and society, visit our website at brainfunction.org.edu. Thanks very much.